Today we are talking about Pete Kwiatkowski, the new defensive coordinator for the University of Texas. He has consistently fielded top 20 defenses for 20 years, yet there isn't a lot known about him. His defensive innovation is admired and emulated in coaching circles, all while remaining fairly unknown to the general populace. Well, until now. Who is this defensive alchemist, a man consistently turning average recruits into gold? Let's deep dive into what makes Coach K great by telling the story of his journey through the ranks while developing an entirely new defense that would go on to stun the college football world. We will learn about his cutting-edge scheme, how he utilizes unique position types to get the most from his players, and most importantly, how he formulates and executes his attacks. There's usually about 5 guys nationwide actually doing something new in football, while everyone else just mimics what they see from the other coaches. PK is always one of those 5 guys nationwide doing his own thing and paving the way for copycat coaches. Call him what you want, mad scientist, silent assassin, evil genius. I prefer to call him PK. Pete has been making more out of less his entire career, and no one punches up quite like he does. PK never had the treasure trove of talent provided by a top 10 college football brand, so he had to use something much more important than talent, his mind. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so I can keep bringing you bigger and better Texas Longhorn content. Ultimately, this is a story about necessity, loyalty, and innovation, all told through the lens of a football coach. But first, I am proud to announce channel memberships are now live. You can financially support quality UT content and get all sorts of exclusive perks. Just click the join button next to the subscribe button on my videos to see all the tiers and perks. And don't forget, this video is sponsored by Last Stand Hats. They are officially licensed by the University of Texas with dozens of hat types and designs to choose from. Use promo code TexasHomer for 10% off your hat purchase. That's promo code TexasHomer, all caps, on laststandhats.com. Link in the description. And without further ado, let's get into it. The story opens with a young 18-year-old Pete Kwiatkowski leaving his childhood home of Santa Barbara, California, to play defensive line for a small school out in Idaho. Pete Kwiatkowski wasn't a blue-chip recruit, didn't have many offers, he was undersized, and he didn't stand out as a superior athlete. But he wanted to play football, and most importantly, he wanted it more than you. The year is 1984, and PK sets out to make the most of his scholarship at Boise State. His sophomore year, he received an All-Big Sky honorable mention, but PK wasn't done yet. He kept working, slowly outpacing the more talented players with his mentality. That sophomore season, he recorded his first sack against a QB named Chris Peterson, who played for UC Davis. Boise State went on to win that game. In his junior year at Boise State, PK began to see the fruits of his labor. He earned first-team All-Big Sky honors and an honorable All-American mention from the Associated Press. PK was making the most out of his time at a relatively unknown program, learning that you can make up for talent with a pure determination to discover the best version of oneself. Pete's senior year, he continued to dominate, picking up a first-team All-American nod, a first-team All-Big Sky selection, and he won Big Sky Defensive Player of the Year for the entire conference. He was loved at Boise State, and he honored their loyalty with his. Despite dominating the Big Sky Conference year after year, the NFL didn't call. Throughout his playing time at Boise State, he learned of his passion for developing and coaching young men like himself. Young men that were looked over, but had the heart and the mind to make it work. Pete graduates from Boise State and immediately joins the coaching staff. He coached at Boise State the next 9 years, and he coached multiple position groups. He coached defensive backs, defensive line, and outside linebackers. Defensive line and outside linebackers is where Pete cut his teeth, and over the years he began to grasp the potential of creating a new kind of defense, highlighting the defensive line and outside linebackers. In fact, fusing them together entirely. In 1997, PK departs Boise State to take a co-DC gig at Tiny Snow Junior College in Utah. Now PK has experience putting the full puzzle together as a defensive coordinator. He got what he needed from that experience and he moves on to another school. He arrives at Eastern Washington to coach the defensive line for the next 2 years. While he was coaching, there was an All-Big Sky defensive back playing for them by the name of Jimmy Lake. PK is continuing to impress with his defensive fronts and developmental prowess. He gets the attention of Montana State, a small respected school known as a breeding ground for football innovation. Kwiatkowski now gets the opportunity to be a defensive coordinator at a university at the next level, opposed to his short stint at Snow Junior College. In 2000, Pete heads to Montana State, and Jimmy Lake gets hired as the DB coach back at Eastern Washington. Montana State is a place where PK goes on to create the best defense in Big Sky history for 4 consecutive seasons. Other coaches start to lift their heads. What the hell is this PK dude doing, and how is he besting himself year after year? And the answer is simple: necessity. Small schools are actually the best breeding ground for offensive and defensive innovation because you can't overpower the competition with superior athletes and high-paid coaches. You can only outsmart them. At this point, the spread offense is starting to take hold amongst the smaller innovative schools. The spread gives traditional defenses serious problems. Receivers in space result in explosive plays, high scores, and waning defenses. Defenses simply weren't prepared for this play style, and they would get worn out going against no-huddle spread teams. Having 4 down linemen and 3 traditional linebackers simply couldn't defend these 3, 4, and 5 receiver sets. They were getting torched left and right. After getting embarrassed defensively, there was this dude named Gary Peterson who had enough. He said, "What if we played with 5 defensive backs instead of 4? And more importantly, what if we made this our base or our core defense so we could match speed with speed on the field at all times?" Usually you had 4 defensive backs on the field, 2 corners and 2 safeties. But when you sub out a linebacker or a defensive lineman and add another defensive back, it totals 5 defensive backs now. 5, nickel, like 5 cents. So all nickel defense means is 5 defensive backs are on the field versus the traditional 4 defensive backs. Teams realized there were advantages against spread teams with more DBs, but no one had made it their base core defense. Gary Peterson did. Around this time, Pete Kwiatkowski is also looking for an edge. He needs to find a way to maximize athletic talent and slow down these increasingly more pass-heavy offenses utilizing the spread. He also catches wind of this Gary Peterson guy, and he learns the value of employing a nickel defense against the spread, so he became a very early adopter of this philosophy. PK continues to develop and modify his defense to optimize against the increasingly dangerous offenses. Around this time, a young creative offensive coordinator named Chris Peterson takes the OC job at Boise State. Pete Kwiatkowski remembers sacking him in his sophomore season at Boise State, when Peterson was the QB for UC Davis. Chris Peterson is dumbfounding defenses with his tricky and resourceful offenses and making a lot of noise at Boise State. In PK's final year at Montana State in 2005, he hires a young Jimmy Lake as his defensive backs coach. In 2006, the head coach at Boise State gets fired, and Chris Peterson is promoted to head coach. He's an offensive guy, and he needs to find a way to field an innovative defense as well. He had his eye on PK throughout his career, and Peterson knew just the guy to bring in to turn Boise State into a national name. Kwiatkowski loves Boise State, and he accepts the offer to return to his alma mater as a defensive line coach, smarter and more deadly than ever. Jimmy Lake departs Montana State at the same time to go coach in the NFL for a few seasons, and current Texas inside linebacker coach Jeff Choate joins the Boise State staff as well as a running backs and special teams coach. In his first year as head coach, Peterson led the Broncos to an undefeated regular season in 2006 and the program's first ever BCS Bowl game berth. He became the 4th rookie head coach to lead a team to a BCS Bowl game. Boise State was the only undefeated team in Division I FBS for the 2006 season. They defeated OU in a 42-43 overtime stunner at the Fiesta Bowl. Seriously, Boise State beating OU with a first-year head coach, that's something we haven't seen. In 2008, they go on to play TCU, helmed by Gary Peterson, the man that inspired PK to create his initial defense. But PK is just the D-line coach at this point. Boise State loses to TCU 16-17 in a defensive battle. Gary Peterson shuts down Boise State's next-level offense with his next-level nickel defense. Boise State then goes on to defeat TCU in 2009 in another low-scoring 17-10 game. Even when Boise State wins against the nickel defense, their offense can still only put up a few measly points. Chris Peterson has to make a move to continue their Cinderella story, as they can't seem to score points like they used to. He promotes Pete Kwiatkowski to defensive coordinator in 2010. In his first year, PK fields the second best defense in the nation. The number 1 defense that year is TCU, led by Gary Peterson. What a coincidence. The 2 guys using this new defensive scheme are both number 1 and 2 in the nation in defense. It must be a fluke. In year 2, Kwiatkowski is the architect of the 12th best defense in the nation. This clearly isn't a one-off. Pete has produced top defenses at Montana State and Boise State. Remember earlier where we learned about nickel defense, which plays 5 defensive backs instead of 4? Well, here's the downside to playing 5 defensive backs in a nickel D. It forces you to sub out a defensive lineman or a linebacker to make room for the added DB, leaving you stranded with less manpower in stopping the run and defending the short pass. So how do you do more work with less people? You use the principle of division of labor. Give each position a unique job to do because you're down a body near the line. Think, PK, think. Well, then who do you sub out? If you sub out a linebacker, you can get thrown on easier and ran on easier. If you sub out a defensive lineman, then you will get ran on easier and thrown on easier because the QB has less pressure. So are you screwed? Yeah, traditionally you were as a non-adaptable coach. You'll see all those old school stubborn coaches disappear one by one because the spread makes you honest. There's nowhere to hide with all that open space. But PK isn't traditional, so he said, how can I make this work? I have 1 less player in the defensive front for a total of 6, but we still need to cover all the responsibilities of a full defensive front with 7 players. The answer is you hybridize roles and fuse together the linebackers and defensive ends, Frankensteining your way to exciting and versatile new position types, making sure your undermanned squad can all cover and rush. And now you're still a man down, but your production won't drop a smidge. Here are the new position types that PK utilizes at the forefront of his modern defensive strategy. First, you remove the 2 traditional defensive ends that are more power players, since you're going to need coverage ability as well for this new concept. Now you take 2 outside linebackers and you place them in the spot of the defensive ends. We call these players edge players because they play on the edge of the offensive line. He could have 4 guys on the line, 3 guys on the line, even 5 guys on the line if the situation calls for it. Pete isn't married to a front because he is skilled enough to alter his defense based on his opponent. It makes him extremely difficult to game plan for because he will always have a full bag of tools. Now, back to the edge outside linebackers. Outside linebackers traditionally are not big enough to hold up against offensive linemen play after play, so you alter their usual physical attributes. You select larger outside linebackers who have speed to rush the edge, the size to fight off offensive linemen consistently, and who can drop back in coverage to stop the short pass. These are unique position types that PK helped to pioneer. There are 2 of these hybrid outside linebacker defensive end players on the field in PK's scheme, but he actually specializes these 2 unique players even more and divides duties between the 2. I would like to introduce to you the jack position and the X linebacker position. The jack is the strong side defensive end outside linebacker hybrid who has a larger emphasis on stopping the run, disruption, and physicality. The jack can drop back in coverage, but it's not his primary skill set. Usually the offensive play is ran to the strong side, meaning the QB or running back is looking in the direction of the jack. His job is to set the edge and not let the QB or running back escape, while blinding the QB's throwing lanes and shoving the offensive tackles into him. The jack is your enforcer on the defensive line. This would be a good spot for Jacoby Jones or Ojimo. 6'3", 260-ish pounds is the ideal build. Now, the other defensive end outside linebacker is called the X-backer, opposed to being called the weak side defensive end or even a will linebacker. He is actually more linebacker than defensive end, unlike the jack position. The X-linebacker plays on the line often, but he's best in pass coverage and he needs to be able to run the seams. He also excels in the pass rush off the weak side to catch the QB focused on the disruptive jack on the other side. He's still larger than a traditional will linebacker, but he isn't as big as his jack counterpart. This would be a good spot for LSU transfer Ray Thornton. Alright, so now you understand how PK is getting more out of less with his hybridized linebacker DNs. But he also changed the roles for the defensive tackles, the middle linebacker, and the strong side linebacker. Usually your middle linebacker is your big, tough run stopper, not known for their agility. Spread offenses know this, and they target the middle linebacker all the time with shallow passes over the middle. It's a major liability that will be exploited by opposing offenses. So Kwiatkowski changed the role of the middle linebacker in this defense to ensure it was actually his best linebacker athlete, who had the instincts to defend athletic players in space. This new Mike linebacker is now focused on zone coverage, shutting down easy over the middle passes, and has the athleticism to match up with slot receivers and tight ends over the middle. This player actually more closely resembles a safety. It would be the ideal fit for DeMarvion Overshone, since he's a former safety and a superb athlete at linebacker. Now we reach our final linebacker. PK has a very unique name for his linebacker that most have never heard of. He calls his strong side backer a dime backer instead. The dime backer is more concerned with pass rush and dogging the interior gaps. He needs to be able to hold up against O-linemen, be a sure tackler, and disrupt the QB on passing downs, along with stopping the run. When you think of the dime backer, you think of a player more like Jawan Mitchell. That would probably be the best spot for him. Finally, we have the defensive tackles. Traditionally, defensive tackles' goal was to break through the offensive line and make the tackle. While PK does use his defensive tackles for this purpose sometimes, it's not the most prominent feature in how he employs the big boys. I call them kamikaze defensive tackles because their jobs are to absorb as many blocks as possible while opening up gaps for the linebackers to rush in and get the sack. They are big, strong kids who latch onto as many offensive linemen as possible to open the door for the blitz. Think of Keandre Coburn, Alfred Collins, subbed with Vernon Broughton and Tavondre Sweat in these roles. We are set at defensive tackle and nose this coming year. Back to the blue turf at Boise State. Pete Kwiatkowski's cutting-edge defense continues to perform. He hired Jimmy Lake that year to coach defensive backs after his return from the NFL. Boise State was 8th nationally in total defense. Despite losing 9 starters that season, Boise State ranked 5th nationally in both pass defense and pass efficiency defense. They ranked 8th nationally in scoring defense, 11th nationally in sacks, and the Broncos ranked 4th nationally, forcing 36 turnovers that led the nation with 18 fumble recoveries. Boise State was the Cinderella of college football, and the Pete Kwiatkowski, Chris Peterson, and Jimmy Lake combo were firing on all cylinders. But there's this pesky thing called reality. It likes to visit sometimes when it feels you've been neglecting it. Year 4 brought a new feeling to the group: failure. Boise State opens the season against the University of Washington. Washington blows them out 38-6. The University of Washington was coached by some new upstart offensive mind named Steve Sarkisian. Boise State went on to drop several games that year. Regardless of the offensive dip, the defense holds tight, with the 2013 Broncos squad ranked 2nd in the conference in points allowed, 2nd in interceptions, 3rd in total D, 3rd in pass efficiency defense, and 4th in sacks. The Broncos placed 2 defensive players on the Mountain West first team, including defensive end DeMarcus Lawrence, who led the league in sacks per game and was 10th nationally with 10.5 sacks overall. He also led the conference in tackles for loss with 20.5 and ranked 3rd nationally. Throughout the past few years, Chris Peterson has become the hottest name in the game, and major schools from around the nation were trying to poach him to no avail. During this time, Steve Sarkisian turns around a dismal University of Washington team and gets lured to the head coaching gig at USC, leaving the University of Washington head coaching job open on the West Coast, where Peterson, Kwiatkowski, and Lake are all from. The University of Washington approaches Peterson with an offer he can't refuse, and Peterson decides it's time to be the head coach of a Power 5 program. So now it's time for Peterson, PK, and Lake to prove their scheme is the real deal at the highest level of college football, Power 5. To Boise State fans' dismay, Chris Peterson announces he accepts the University of Washington job. Pete Kwiatkowski and Jimmy Lake follow to Washington, and the band is still together. They set up shop in Seattle and they begin a new era of Washington prominence. They go 8-5 in year 1 with some promising players for the future. Year 1 was really just getting their heads screwed on straight. You'll soon see why this core group of Chris Peterson, Pete Kwiatkowski, and Jimmy Lake are so revered by fellow coaches. Because it wasn't just some small school scheme they were running. This strategy was ready for the prime time. Year 2 and 3 were Pete's breakout seasons as PK commanded the number 13 and number 8 defenses in the nation respectively. They were somehow continuing their success and turning the University of Washington into a multi-year Pac-12 champion. And this is how PK did it against the top teams in the league like USC, Oregon, and Washington State. Here's the reality of facing really good spread teams. They will beat you every single time if you can't wreak havoc up front. Wide receivers are too skilled and in too much space to reliably shut them down 85 plus plays per game. There are generally 3 to 4 receivers on every play, plus the offense automatically has the largest advantage in the entire game of football. They know what's going to happen on each and every play. Wide receivers are going to get free and they will score, It's inevitable facing these modern space exploiting offenses. So let's pack it up and head home. No need for defenses anymore. We had a good run though. But the game of football is finally solved. So it's been real, everyone. Peace. Except wait, there is one way to reliably hamper an offense that physically talented, and that's to attack its mind. In business, there is this concept called the single point of failure. It theorizes that you can weaken a competing organization not by defeating the entire organization as a whole, but by attacking one singular piece that all the other pieces rely upon. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter, if you will. Think of it like a heist movie. You want to steal that painting from the museum, but there are lasers everywhere. You won't succeed in trying to creep in between each and every laser. So the intelligent thing to do is walk outside and shut off the power controlling the lasers, aka attacking its single point of failure. So what is the single point of failure in an opposing offense? Who is the one player that if playing poorly will affect every single other player? That's right, the quarterback. But there's this group of 5 giant guys that guard that pesky quarterback. So a great way to dismantle an opposing QB is to make him feel unsafe. And that's because he is. To understand PK's intelligence, you have to understand how the offensive line does their best work. Double teams. The offensive line doesn't like one-on-one blocks because it benefits the defense. If 5 O-linemen match up against 5 defenders, only one defender has to win to disrupt the play. But all 5 offensive linemen have to win to successfully execute the play. That's awful odds for the O-line, and they know that, hence the focus on double teams. So the offensive line already has a preference to use double teams, so give them what they want. But here's the smart part, it's a deal with the devil. The average football viewer believes defensive tackles are looking to avoid blocks and get to the QB or running back, and it's the total opposite. DTs should absorb as many blocks as possible, opening the door for smaller, quicker LBs to dart in and get the sack. This was a defense built from necessity out at Montana State. You'll never be able to compete on a player-to-player basis. You have to be resourceful and crafty. Without a 5-star in sight, how can you win? Here's what it looks like in practice. The offensive line always has to count how many defenders are rushing, and they have to adjust their blocks to match that. But what if you showed pressure and then bailed so that certain offensive linemen are now unemployed and standing there with their arms out with no one to block like a doofus? Now, if you left one offensive lineman unemployed with no one to block, then that means the other 4 offensive linemen have to absorb more defenders. This allows defensive tackles to overwhelm the offensive line, absorb 2 blocks each for a total of 4 blocks, with your final offensive lineman standing by himself with no one to block. You just neutralize the entire offensive line with 2 defensive tackles and a well-placed fake pressure by a linebacker. This leaves the remaining 4 defensive front players the opportunity to shoot into one of the many open gaps and sack the quarterback. And they don't just pour in predictably. They send their skill defenders on loops and stunts, disguising their true intentions and catching a thoroughly confused offensive line off guard. It's a symphony of controlled chaos if you execute it correctly. The opposing quarterback is now intellectually overwhelmed. How did that few people cause that much damage? How many gaps are open, exposing me to a big hit? Where would the pressure even come from with 4 pass rushers to choose from? He's confused and he feels vulnerable. He starts rushing throws and forcing bad calls into multi-coverage. He starts to see ghosts and scrambles out of the pocket, just in time to run smack dab into PK's jack player. The QB is no longer functioning at a high level, and now you can defeat the spread. Before the 2017 season at UW, Lake is hot due to his stellar DB development and unique defensive pass game schemes. Rumors are flying all around campus that schools want him as defensive coordinator. He catches the eye of the most successful secondary coach ever, Nick Saban. If Nick Saban is impressed with your DBs, then there is no bigger compliment in the sport. So of course, Bama hires Lake and the UW coach dream team collapses. Lake has no choice but to take the Alabama gig. It's more money, more prestige, and a promotion. Wait, it says here that Lake didn't take the Bama job. How? Why? Peterson and Kwiatkowski get wind of Alabama's interests, and they meet to hatch a plan. The only way to keep Lake would be a fat raise and a promotion to defensive coordinator, but PK is already the defensive coordinator. Lake is partial to the state of Washington, and he would love nothing more than be the head coach of UW one day. Chris Peterson at this point is beginning to struggle with the physical effects from stresses of the job. They decide together that PK will demote to co-DC, relinquishing his DC title to Jimmy Lake, but more important, with a handshake deal to let Lake take over as the head coach for the University of Washington when Peterson finally decides to pull the trigger on retirement. So PK willingly demotes to keep Peterson, Lake, and himself together. Loyalty at its finest. He is co-DC, but he also goes back to coaching outside linebackers as a position coach. After making the change, Chris Peterson, Jimmy Lake, and Pete Kwiatkowski go on to have back-to-back number 5 defenses in the nation. The entire college football world is looking at the University of Washington and what it's been able to do with the defensive direction of Pete Kwiatkowski and Lake. The trio lands 2 Pac-12 championships in 2016 and 2018. PK and Lake have reliably turned lesser talent into NFL draft picks, with many going in the first round. PK has 14 first and second round picks, 40 total including all of the rounds. But how does PK size up a potential recruit? What is he looking for? I think honestly, he's looking for himself. First, he wants a kid with a motor who is relentless and runs to the football. He wants to see that chip on the shoulder, and the recruit should have a different, more intense mindset than most. PK says what they are really doing throughout the recruiting process is trying to figure out who the intelligent guys are, which guys are going to do right in the community, and be respectful to all members of the school, including faculty and fellow students. Then he goes on to evaluate their athletic skills. He wants to see quickness, strength, explosiveness, and agility from his defensive front players, since they have unique hybridized roles. Pete has such a talent for developing non-blue chips, meaning 3 stars and below, that he actually isn't focused on athletic traits when he first catches wind of a recruit. He's confident he can make them better football players, but it's much harder to teach intelligence or leadership. After he is sure that they play with passion, have the intelligence, and won't bring negative press to the university, then he starts breaking down those athletic traits. PK has found immense success with his formula, and during his time as defensive coordinator and co-defensive coordinator, PK had a total of 17 members of the Husky defense drafted by NFL teams, with several more signing as free agents. After his first season in Seattle, Kwiatkowski saw 4 members of his defense selected in the first 44 picks of the 2015 NFL Draft. The following year, outside linebacker Travis Feeney was selected by the Steelers. In 2017, more defensive players were taken in the first 2 rounds: Kevin King, Buda Baker, and Sidney Jones. In 2018, defensive tackle Vita Vea was a first-round pick, while linebackers Azim Victor and Keyshawn Bierra were also drafted. In 2019, 5 more Husky defenders were selected in the NFL Draft: second-rounders Byron Murphy and Taylor Rapp, along with D-lineman Greg Gaines and linebacker Ben Burr-Kirvin and corner Jordan Miller. For all the hype around his defensive genius, his most impressive trait is seeing potentials in guys where others couldn't. Pete Kwiatkowski is one of the nation's best developers. This is your favorite coach's favorite coach. But all good things must come to an end. Chris Peterson continues to struggle with the effects of having such a high-pressure job. He's not happy anymore, and he starts to rethink his priorities. He proved what he wanted to in the sport, that intelligent schemes and good development can trump superior athletes and big money. Ultimately, he decides to step down. It's the end of the Peterson era, and the legendary coaching trio is now just a duo. Lake promotes to head coach as promised, and PK is back as defensive coordinator. Losing a top 5 coach in Chris Peterson is a gigantic shift. Washington still did well and fielded the number 16 defense in the nation. 2020 arrives and the world turns upside down with the coronavirus. The Pac-12 lost their entire preseason, and they played an abbreviated schedule of only 7 games. Defense dropped to number 39 in the nation. This UW team requires coaching and development, and taking away early practices proved to be too high of a hurdle. Zoom meetings just weren't cutting it. Now PK is sitting in Seattle, his core group no longer intact with the departure of Chris Peterson. His young protege in Jimmy Lake has made it to a Power 5 head coach with a giant thanks to him. PK was loyal until the very end to Chris Peterson and Jimmy Lake. But as you age, I have to imagine you begin to question if you could have done it at the highest level. What could PK do at a major program with all the bells and whistles, without scarcity of talent, with all the money in the world? It's the University of Texas on the phone.
When people ask me why Texas, why not?
Steve Sarkisian didn't forget his old foe during his USC days in Pete Kwiatkowski, and it seems PK didn't forget Sark either. Pete decided it was time for a change, and now is the moment to go test his scheme at the highest level in college football. Sark specifically wanted multiplicity on his defense, meaning that you have many different looks. Here's a quote from a University of Washington linebacker talking about PK. He spends so much time in the film room, seeing what the opponent is doing, and every week he comes out with some new scheme we haven't seen, some little tweak that gives us an edge. You're not really going to get that from another coach. Sark's offense is already incredibly hard to prepare for, and now Sark's defense will be just as hard to prepare for. You are pairing a top 3 offensive mind with a top 3 defensive mind, and the results should be significant. This was a look at his story while learning the defense he employs. But he's not done innovating. I'm sure we will see new things never mentioned in this video, and I can't wait to see what comes next. I know Pete Kwiatkowski was the mystery man hire for many of us fans, but I hope you are able to see now why this hire was incredibly important. This is an understated assassin looking for every single edge he can get his hands on, but now he marries this innovative, resourceful defensive philosophy with 5 stars and top 100 players. Pete has proved doubters wrong every single step of the way since he was 18 years old, and I don't think now is the time to start doubting him. What are you most excited for in PK's new defense? Do you like the strategy he employs? You can watch more of my videos here, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with fellow Texas fans. Also, don't forget to join the new channel memberships to support more content. Hook 'em.